Hi everyone, welcome to See the Invisible, living with an invisible or rare disease. My name is Rhonda Franny Jefferson, and thank you so much for taking some time out to listen today. If you're new to this podcast, welcome. To share a little bit about myself as well as what I hope to do with this podcast. I do have an invisible and rare illness. It has caused challenges or obstacles in my daily life, and especially over this past year, adjusting to, everything that was going on with COVID-19 and, just some interactions I had on social media and things I was reading in articles. I really wanted to take some of the energy that I had regarding, hearing some not so positive things at times. I wanted to turn that around and try to put that energy into something productive. And, I found that I really do enjoy making this podcast every week, that it is actually pretty therapeutic for me as well. So I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share my story or share some of my experiences. So I hope that you get a little bit of positivity or support out of listening. I do always like to share as well that I am in no way a medical, insurance, or legal expert. If you do have any questions in any of those fields, please be sure that you're reaching out to experts in those areas. So, to get back to what I was discussing last week, I was taking a look at some comparisons between the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak and the current pandemic. The so-called Spanish flu actually was misnamed. It isn't entirely known where it began, but the first known case was actually in the U.S., and the fact that it was wartime with people going overseas really did help spread the influenza. So just a very quick recap, as some of this will tie together with what we'll be discussing today. The media for morale did not really share a lot about the influenza, and Spain, as they were not involved at all with the war, the media actually covered what was occurring at that time. So because it was being reported primarily from Spain, it got the name the Spanish flu, even though some other countries called it other names. So looking back over the past year and trying to surmise what happened during the 1918 pandemic, because there really wasn't a lot about how, technology played a part, because they didn't have the technology that we have now. They didn't have, in some ways, the social conscience that we have now. So in some aspects, there were some very big similarities, but in other areas, there really was a lack of understanding, a lack of communication, and in some cases, just a lack of knowing that other people had different needs that, not everybody else had. So looking first at ease and willingness of communication, those are two areas that, we are really surpassing 1918. Partially that's due to technology. The other part is due to the fact that there's not propaganda or morale that's being spread. It's, basically information is just being spread as, as a human being, we have that right to have this information as it's affecting us. So, conversely, in 1918, it was looked at as, in some cases, a way to decrease morale. So they didn't really have the information that we have, that in 5 seconds we can type something into the computer and get an answer. I do realize that at the very, very early onset of this pandemic, we may not have had all of the information, and it didn't get to us as soon as possible. But once we did start receiving the communication, in large part, we were able to attain the information that we were looking for. So very early on, there was the talk of we need a vaccine and we need a vaccine soon. Now, traditionally, vaccines have taken years to develop, so the idea of bringing about a vaccine in a relatively short period of time was, a very big goal. It was also in some ways scary, because all of the trials and tests that usually take place probably would not be taking place with this particular vaccine, or if so, it would be on a much smaller scale. And many different companies started to work on the vaccines, and in less than a year, there were a couple of viable vaccines that were being used to prevent COVID. Now, I did want to take a look at kind of the timeline or chronology, I can't even speak today, of vaccines. So the very first vaccine that I was able to find information on actually was a little bit further back than I thought it would be. It was in 1796 for smallpox. And just to mention too, any of the sources that I've used, I will link down into the description of the podcast or the YouTube video. So that way, if you wanted to read more about it, you'll be able to go in and do so. Now, with smallpox, that vaccine being developed in 1796, the next vaccine actually wasn't until 1880, and that was for cholera. And in the latter part of the 19th century, so between 1880 and 1900, there were an additional 5 vaccines developed after the cholera vaccine. But as the 20th century progressed, more and more vaccines came to be developed. Also, there were different types of vaccines, so it could be either a first vaccine of that particular disease, or as well as big changes in the way some vaccines were administered. To give you an example, I'm actually allergic to the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, as well as the flu vaccine. I'm allergic to eggs, and those vaccines are incubated, or at least that's the term I've heard used before, in egg. So actually with the development of the COVID vaccine, that was the very first thing that I needed to know. Once the first one came out, I searched for that, and at least according to the articles that I've read, that the vaccines are not incubated in eggs. But there has been a development of a vaccine that is a spray or mist that is inhaled through the nose. So those are the different types of vaccines that they're being developed as well. And the one that's used as the spray mist is not developed in egg. Now, being in a rural area, none of the doctors, at least here, keep those on hand. So if I were to get a flu vaccine, I would need to order it through one of the pharmacies. It might be different in different parts of the country, depending on whether it's a large city that you live in or in a more rural area such as mine. Now, researchers did try to work on a vaccine for the influenza in 1918, but it was actually developed and it would fight a bacteria. So pretty much, since influenza is a virus, it had no effect. It was pretty much nil, in my opinion. So going forward then, in knowing that there is medical technology, more advanced today, it makes me wonder if there had been the same technology back in 1918, who would get the vaccines? As we're looking at the pandemic now, there are orders in which the vaccine is being given out in most states, depending on the supply that's available. So, for example, in my state, it's being given to educational personnel, so teachers, and those who are 65 and over. The next phase, in phase 1, I would be able to get the vaccine, even though my doctor does actually want me to see an immunologist because of the other allergies that I do have. So even though the scheduling would allow me to get a vaccine because I do have an underlying condition, my doctor wants me to see that immunologist, and the first appointment that I could get, and I scheduled this appointment a couple of months ago, so very early on, I don't have that appointment until the end of March. So it would be a while until I can actually get mine. So this kind of leads into something else that I think that we experience more now, or at least it's more reported on and more recognized as compared to 1918, and that's the awareness of differences in what different people need. So again, we're kind of looking at the vaccines. It's not being handed out because you can afford it. It's being given to those who need it based on very specific criteria. There is now this recognition too that if someone gets a vaccine and they weren't in that criteria, you would probably see their picture on social media. I've seen that shared with celebrities or those who are in the spotlight. If they've shared that they received the vaccine, how other people are reacting to it. So there's more of a social conscience, I think, right now. Again, there really wasn't a lot in some of these areas that I could find related to 1918. And while I think within certain communities, for those who were not as financially well off, they would have recognized the different needs, but not everybody did so. So going back to 1918, there really was that big gap between socioeconomic groups. And, I unfortunately think that in those days, if there had been a vaccine developed, that it probably would have gone to those who had more money first. So looking at some side-by-side comparisons, in 1918, the biggest thing they were looking at was containment. So they limited the hours that, markets were open, things like that. Today, there was a very quick reaction and plexiglass was put up between the checkers and those who were buying things at grocery stores. I know even in the medical office where I'd get my infusion, there were plexiglass dividers so that, I could still get the infusion that I needed, but there was a barrier between myself and the next person. And everybody who was getting those infusions all had compromised immune systems. And so the reaction and the need, that was very, very similar. There had to be some containment, such as, the access to grocery stores. That was essential, no matter whether it was 1918 or today. So we did react, as well as those in 1918 reacted, but because of the advances in technology, we could put up things like the barriers much quicker than anybody could in 1918. And even if they were able to do so, they wouldn't be as effective. And plexiglass is pretty modern invention compared to being in 1918. I know that, as well as just using the grocery store as one of the examples. I know that there was a small brewery near where I live. They actually converted to producing hand sanitizer because there was a shortage. So that showed not only, that different businesses were able to adapt in different ways, but also the willingness to forego really their main product to try to help support those who really needed it. So that was pretty important. But looking at then the needs of individuals, people do have to go out and work. That's today or 1918. Now, today there are a lot more jobs that can be done from home, and that's looking at percentages. Just looking at the population of the world in 1918 compared to today. Again, there's a vast difference there, but just looking at percentages, things that would have been done in person, 100 years ago, it can now be done via computer. So there were a lot of people who were able to come in and work from home. But again, not everybody could do that. So, you still have those first responders. You still have those who are on the front lines. And, some of the unsung heroes are the people who did deliveries, who, every day they're coming into contact with dozens, if not hundreds of people. And they're doing that, and it's helping their neighbor. It's helping their town, state, even their country, just try to get through this. So, again, I think they're kind of the unsung heroes in this whole pandemic. And, I've even gotten to know a couple by name. I'll get a little text message saying that someone's on her way, and I'll recognize the car. And I'm just really appreciative of the fact that we had that ability right now. Now, for those who are watching on YouTube, I don't have a lot of fancy recording equipment or anything like that. You may see some jumps or pauses in the recording. Sometimes I have some difficulty breathing due to the illness that I have, and so I might pause and then come back. So if you see a few jumps, that's the reason why. But I apologize for that. I think the weather has been really, really cold, and that's starting to get to me a little bit more right now. But going back to the workers who, have been there doing what we needed from day one, they also have to look at their personal lives as well. Do they have someone that they live with who's immunocompromised, someone who's elderly or at risk? Not only then are they themselves on the front lines, they have to be careful about coming home. And I'll let you know, for the first few weeks of the pandemic, my husband and I were on completely different parts of the house. I was on one side, he was on the other, and he was working, but it was a precaution and making sure that there wasn't this cross-contamination. And at one point, it was kind of a couple parties removed, but someone that he comes into indirect contact with very early on did have COVID. And so that was kind of scary, knowing how close it could be. So everybody who's been out there working has had to face that. I also know then, looking at other things that we've been able to do with communication, such as, I've seen the ability to have someone in sign language communicating through the computer. If you need to ask a question in person, there is a way to use an interpreter or sign language interpreter online. So I think that's very wonderful that, that's able to be done so that everybody is getting effective communication. The same thing, making sure that websites are accessible for those who have vision needs so that they're able to get the information as well that they need. In 1918, there was social distancing. It wasn't necessarily called social distancing, but that's what it was. That was not a universally accepted term or recognized term that we now know. But just to give an idea of some of the similarities, ships were sometimes quarantined going into some ports because of the influenza. Now, unfortunately, just like today too, there were masks that were being used, but there were groups who did not want to use them. I did find online there was a group called the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco. And, so for all those who, don't want to wear masks, the same thing was going on back then. But I believe it was the Red Cross. They actually used that used a mask to show patriotism, saying that, the country was being supported if you wore a mask. So it was kind of twofold. It really fed on patriotism for those who may have had loved ones overseas, and this feeling that if you did not wear a mask, then you were unpatriotic. And that's the way it was looked at in 1918 in many places. Now, one of the bigger differences was, I guess I have to say it was actually the same but different, was the closure of schools. Today we have concerns such as, okay, both parents are still working. How is our child going to be able to attend school virtually? They may have to rearrange schedules to make sure that there's someone home at all times with the child, keeping an eye on the child to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. There were concerns for children who relied on school food programs. And, I have to admit, I live in an area where, 2 meals a day are provided to every child. And that was a very big concern about how am I going to add on 2 meals a day for 2 very growing boys. But fortunately, some of those programs still continued, but the person would have to go and pick up the food, which not everybody would have that capability. Not everybody has a car. Speaking of, what everybody may or may not have available, not everybody would have high-speed internet. Not everybody may have a computer or access to a computer where they could work from home. And early on, where I'm from, at the end of the previous year, the end of the 2019-2020 school year, not everybody initially received a tablet or a Chromebook. The computer that we had was very, very basic, and neither one of my children were really succeeding with that. But we were able to get a Chromebook from the school. As the summer progressed, though, between the 2019-2020 school year going to 2020-2021, then each child had a Chromebook, at least in my district. But again, that may not be the same in every district, and not every child will have the same access. And the internet is just a whole other story in the fact that, I know that I received information that it was a possibility that my internet prices would be going up, and I couldn't afford that. And even just trying to find ways to defray cost or bring costs down, I didn't qualify for some of the new incentives they had at my cable and internet company. So there were just all these things that we're looking at today. The way it was looked at 100 years ago, in many larger cities, there was more of a concern about children not going to school because school was actually safer. The living conditions for many of the children in the larger cities was, to use a term that I read, they were living in tenements. Sometimes there were multiple families or a very large family in one apartment. They shared toilets and just the hygiene, just because of the situation, not because of the individuals, but because of the situation and what was available for them to live at the time. It was actually safer for them to go to school, and that's what parents were worried about. So New York and Chicago actually made a decision not to shut down the schools. And that was a decision that, given some of those other factors, that they were 2 of the largest cities in the U.S., and what many of their students, faced, it was a safer option to keep the schools open. And I can really say, too, that the principal at one of the schools that my son attends, I have 2 sons, and both have had this principal, and she is fantastic. But one day, I was checking on the kids, seeing how they were doing, And my son was sitting there in his Zoom class, but all he had was a blanket wrapped around him. And I'm like, what are you doing? 10 minutes ago you were dressed. What's going on? And I was wondering and pretty much freaking out a little bit about him being on a Zoom. And he told me that they could turn off the camera. And we actually had parent-teacher conferences the following day, all done by telephone. And I asked his teacher, was that acceptable that he turns off the camera? And she told me that it was, because not every child has the same background. And when I talk about background, I'm actually physically talking about a background that they might have behind them, that way nobody needed to feel self-conscious. And I really think that was an insight that not everybody would have. I know that I didn't. But that's, again, another example of how I think we're recognizing different needs right now, more so than in 1918. Unfortunately, and again, I couldn't find as much specifically about the socioeconomic impact, of the individuals and how that played into the influenza. But we can make assumptions, that I think that a lot of people probably had to look at just their family and how they could keep their families safe, because, they were in such a situation where, unfortunately, there was a high percentage of, if one or two people got the influenza in a building, then that would probably move through very quickly. Now, as I'm reviewing the amount of information that I still have, I am thinking this is going to go to 3 episodes. I really don't want to make each episode longer than a half an hour, unless I really need to. I will be taking this a little over a half an hour, because I think there's a good cutoff point, and that way we can kind of go into the next step next week. But just to give a quick rundown of similarities and differences, the shutdown of religious institutions, that angered many, many people. We see that now. And, just thinking about it, right now I know that churches are doing things online, but, not really having, a background on how collection or donations are made through the church. I mean, I've attended church for most of my life, but I've never worked in the aspect of, balancing the books or doing the collection. I would have to imagine that as the services have been moved to online, there's probably some people who aren't donating as much for that reason. But then I apologize. But also second, some people may not be able to give. They may not be in a situation where they're able to provide a donation or something, donated to the church. Right now, we also, have concerns from hourly workers who, are just afraid of, what if the next paycheck doesn't cover what I need? There are millions and millions of people that fall into this middle ground of they don't qualify for unemployment, but at the same time they're losing hours. And so it's kind of this cycle that, they don't have quite enough to cover what they need to cover, but they're not able to collect some of the benefits. But in 1918, there were no or very little social benefits. It was usually done through churches and charities, but not necessarily through the government. So, even though I know there are, like I said, millions of people who are kind of falling into that middle ground, there are some other supports, such as the eviction moratoriums, things like that, that are trying to at least provide some type of respite for those who are concerned, with the loss of hours. I was actually taken out of work the day that everything really started to close down for COVID, but it was not related to COVID. I had a severe infection that it was a tough time because I didn't know if I was going to be able to overcome that infection. It was one of the most severe that I'd ever had. So, it was really taking a while for my body to come back. And, I had spoken with my doctor, and I'd pretty much held on as long as I could with working. And so it just kind of happened to all come about at the same time. My husband was laid off at the time. He did go back to work, but now he's laid off again, which, sometimes due to seasonality with his job, that does occur. But there's just a lot of unknowns for a lot of people out there. The medical system has been, flooded. I don't even think that's an accurate enough word to describe it. The medical personnel, and this includes everyone who works in any type of medical profession, from those who help do the maintenance in hospitals to the doctors and nurses. They really are the backbone of, getting us through this pandemic. I personally know someone who did work at a hospital. She's been in healthcare, it seems like forever. And she did pass away from COVID. And again, being in a rural area, it's a smaller hospital, but it's one of the few hospitals around. Pretty much you would have to go 45 minutes in any direction to get to another hospital. And it really hit the hospital hard. It hit the community hard, at least those that, I knew. And she was a wonderful woman. And to lose, someone who was always so happy and so giving, she gave her life to help others. And everybody who is working in the medical field right now, they are risking their lives every day, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. Going back to the comparisons between 1918 and now, there were changes in the estimates of how long the outbreak was going to last, and we see that now as there going to be a third surge is what we're looking at now. Also, then as now, things are controlled by state, so there's no federal mandates for a lot of things. It's controlled individually by a state, and therefore there's inconsistencies, and disinformation about the actual medical information is out there. Back in 1918, people were really looking towards what people were telling them would work. And unfortunately, there were con men back there, or back at that time, and would say things use soda water or use rubbing alcohol. One of them was to put an onion on your chest, half an onion, rubbing that on your chest. And people were so desperate, they were doing whatever they could do. These may have been people who couldn't necessarily afford to go to a doctor or go to the hospital, so they were depending on what other people were telling them. But I think, as with many different challenges that we as a country in the U.S. have faced, and even seeing it around the world, volunteers, those who give back, they have been out in full force as well. During the pandemic of 1918 to 1920, there were nurses who would visit homes to, check on people, try to give advice. And if the nurse couldn't necessarily get there through public transit, people would volunteer their cars or drive the nurses to where they needed to go. They would, make food or donate food to those who needed it. So, we can't say that, all those who had, had the products or goods to share. There may have been some who didn't share, but there were a lot of people who did. So they helped, their neighbors, even if they didn't live in the same neighborhood. They helped their neighbors get through. And today, I know in my community there were businesses that sponsored food giveaways. And, a lot of families really depended on that. Masks were sewn by volunteers then, just as they were now. So there's really a lot of similarities in how the pandemic was approached in, both 1918 and in 2020. The differences in those may have just been because of the technology that was available now as compared to then, but the actual intent was still the same. But there were also the bigger differences, such as the communication, and again, really what would be affecting, myself, my family, as far as looking at the needs of those who needed some other types of accommodations. That's what we're really going to get into in the next podcast. I'm sorry that if this seems more like a history lesson. I just think it's important to have a good, solid understanding of, what people really looked at in 1918. And while, the times were different, at its core, I think most people are good. Maybe I'm naive at times in that. But I do believe most people are good, and for the most part, people pull together. And I think it says something, too, that in the two larger cities, Chicago and New York, who did not shut down, they recognized the need for the schools to stay open for those who, couldn't necessarily afford to have a tutor or, put their children in a private school. They recognized the need of what those parents, were thinking about, the needs that the parents knew it was safer for their children to stay home. So I think it's very, very important that we do recognize that in those larger cities. But it was also not having some of the access we have now to the government aid and assistance. They didn't have things such as food stamps or, emergency aid for those who weren't able to afford things. So even in some ways where they may have recognized certain things, there was not always the capability to fulfill those needs. And then, as I was saying too, there were times where they just didn't recognize the needs of everyone. So again, that's where I'm going to really pick up next week. I'm looking at how COVID-19 affects those with disabilities or chronic illness, and seeing what we're doing today to help make sure those needs are met. But finding more information on how that was approached in 1918 is very limited. I'm probably going to have to kind of deduce what the reaction was based on, different factors. But, I do appreciate the fact that there were things that were put into place to help those who had the underlying conditions or possibly had a disability who would not be able to get out and do what they necessarily needed to do, not only because of the disability, but because of the pandemic. So we'll pick up there next week. I do appreciate you hanging in through all the history lessons. I think it is a little interesting, though, to look back at the different time periods and see how it was being handled. But again, also knowing that at the core, really people are still the same in a lot of ways. As I mentioned previously, I will link my sources into the description of the podcast or YouTube description, as well as my contact information. If you have any ideas about any topics you'd like to cover, I would really appreciate that. I really do want to recognize that everybody is different and unique. And I know what my experiences are. They're not going to be the same as, other people's experiences. Even if we have the same illness or live in the same area, there's going to be differences. And I want to recognize, what everybody needs for support in our community. So I really, again, appreciate you taking time out to listen to the podcast. I really appreciate that. And if you have any ideas, shoot me an email, or Facebook. I have a Facebook page, Twitter. Probably Facebook's the quickest way to get to me. But I will talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.